Have you ever seen the lorries that really built Britain? Not the shiny showpieces. I'm talking the real ones. Austin was making beasts long before people noticed. Wartime haulers, load-bearing brutes, proper legends. Some of these rigs haven't been talked about in decades, but today, we're bringing them back. All right. 1913. No motorways, no real road network. Most people were still relying on horses to move things from point A to point B. And then, bam. Austin rolls out with this boxy brute of a machine, the 2-ton lorry. Now, let's be honest, it looked more like a steam wagon than a modern lorry. Solid rubber tires, exposed drive chain, skinny steel wheels that probably gave the driver a free chiropractic session with every bump. But here's the thing, it worked. That alone made it revolutionary. 2 tons of payload might not sound impressive now, but back then, that was a game changer. It meant one vehicle could do the job of several carts, and it didn't need to be fed oats or put to bed. It could just keep going, as long as you kept oil in it and the driver had enough patience to wrangle the early gearbox. It also marked the moment Austin put its foot down and said, "We're not just making cars, we're here to haul too." And considering they entered the commercial scene just before the First World War, the timing was wild. This lorry laid the foundation, literally and figuratively, for everything that came after it. Without it, the rest of the Austin lineup probably wouldn't exist. But Austin didn't stop there. Once they proved they could build a hauler, they went bigger. Literally. Let's jump ahead a bit, because the Austin 702? That's when things got serious. We're talking about a 7-ton workhorse, a real heavyweight. The kind of lorry you'd see hauling timber, coal, bricks, whatever the job demanded. And unlike some of the more common utility lorries of the era, the 702 didn't mess about. It wasn't trying to be compact or nimble. It was here to pull its weight, literally. These were the types of lorries that got run into the ground and then still kept going. If you've ever seen one parked behind an old barn with a tree growing through its chassis, chances are it drove itself there and gave up when it finally had nothing left to prove. Its tall, squared-off cab gave it presence, and the chassis underneath? Overbuilt and proud of it. The kind of build that didn't rely on comfort, but on sheer resilience. Drivers knew they were in for a workout behind the wheel, but they also knew the lorry wouldn't let them down. And here's the thing, this wasn't a war machine. It wasn't built for drama. It was built for Monday mornings at the docks. Friendless back and forth hauls from mill to market. That unglamorous, totally vital, heavy haulage grind. The 702 was one of those vehicles that didn't end up in history books, but it should have. Because it quietly kept Britain moving while everyone else was just trying to keep up. But just as things were picking up, the world changed, and Austin had to pivot fast. Now this one? It's a bit of an underdog in the lineup. The Austin K30. Released in 1939, just before the full chaos of World War II kicked off, the K30 was a 30 hundredweight lorry, so about a 1.5-ton payload. And on paper, it's not the most impressive, but that's kind of the point. The K30 was never meant to be flashy. It was a practical, efficient platform. It had a short wheelbase, made it ideal for navigating tight roads and rural routes, especially in the pre-motorway era where half the roads were still just gravel or compacted dirt. Mechanically, it was straightforward, even a bit crude, but that made it easy to fix. And when parts were scarce, and they often were, that simplicity was gold. You didn't need a specialist to get one back on the road, just some elbow grease and maybe a few swear words. When war broke out, the military saw the value straight away. This wasn't a frontline vehicle, but it was perfect for support roles. Hauling gear, delivering rations, or just being the lorry that showed up on time when everything else was stuck in the mud. And what's wild is how many of these lorries just kept going. Post-war, a lot of them were sold off and repurposed for everything from delivery work to farm life. Repainted, patched up, thrown back into service, and still getting the job done. It didn't get the spotlight, but the K30 earned its keep. And then some. And then came the K2, the lorry that wasn't just built for the war, but built for the moment. If you're into military vehicles, this one probably rings a bell. And if it doesn't, well, you're about to understand why it should. The K2 was Austin's 2-ton answer to wartime transport needs. Released just before World War II, it quickly became one of the go-to vehicles for the British Army. And not just in one role either. This thing was a proper multitasker. The most iconic version? Definitely the ambulance variant. You've seen it in films, photographs, maybe even documentaries. Boxy rear body, Red Cross logo, rear hinged doors. It became the unofficial symbol of battlefield support. But it wasn't just about what it carried, it was about where it could go. With a short or long wheelbase, the K2 could be spec'd for everything from rough rural terrain to frontline logistics. And it had that tough, squared-off cab design that just screamed, "We're here to work." Inside the cab? Basic. No frills. But that also meant less to go wrong. And in wartime, that's exactly what you want. Something that'll start on a cold morning, even if it's been sitting on a tarp in the rain for weeks. After the war, the K2 didn't disappear. A lot of them were sold off as surplus and found second lives in civilian roles. Mobile shops, campers, breakdown lorries, people got creative because the bones of the K2 were just that solid. It was one of those vehicles where you could feel the design was built around need, not luxury. A lorry with zero ego and one job: get there and get back. And for thousands of soldiers and medics, it delivered. But sometimes, 2 tons just wasn't enough. Enter the K3, its bigger, stronger sibling. If the K2 was your sturdy all-rounder, the Austin K3 was the one you called in when you needed that bit more grunt. A proper 3-tonner, long wheelbase with a taller stance and a broader frame. It looked like the K2's older brother, and drove like one too. Built during the war years, the K3 was another military mainstay. These lorries were everywhere, transporting troops, carrying heavy gear, ferrying fuel and food supplies to where they were needed most. They weren't glamorous, but they were essential. The kind of lorry that got written into supply orders, not history books. What made the K3 a standout was its ability to balance payload with reliability. It was big enough to carry serious cargo, but not so oversized that it became a nightmare to maneuver. And when you're hauling through rough ground, think bombed out roads, uneven terrain, icy hills in Europe, that balance matters. It came with a petrol engine, just like most lorries of the era, and while it wasn't exactly fuel efficient, it was straightforward to fix. Mechanics loved them because they were predictable. The engine sat up front, easy to access. The chassis was strong, built like it expected to be punished, and often was. And here's something people forgot. Many K3s weren't scrapped after the war. They were sold off as surplus, bought by farmers, contractors, and even traveling fairgrounds. You'd see them painted bright colors, rebodied into flatbeds, recovery wagons, livestock carriers, whatever someone needed. So, while the K3 wasn't designed for post-war Britain, it ended up playing a pretty big role in rebuilding it. Not bad for a lorry that was meant to just survive the battlefield. Still, Austin had one more ace up its sleeve, and it was a heavy one. Now we're stepping into the heavy stuff. The Austin K4 was the largest of this wartime K-series trio, a 5-ton payload monster. And when you look at one in the photos, it's got presence. Wide frame, tall cab, long wheelbase, it just looks like it means business. The K4 didn't mess around. It was designed for the big jobs, carrying artillery pieces, engineering equipment, bridging gear, bulk supplies, anything that couldn't fit on a K2 or a K3. If there was a need to move something hefty, this was the lorry that got the call. It shared a lot of its DNA with the smaller models, same cab design, similar suspension, but it was scaled up across the board. And that extra size brought a few challenges. It was heavier to steer, harder to park, and guzzled more fuel. But none of that mattered when the job was just to get it there. These lorries served in all kinds of environments. You'd see them at docks, airfields, and engineering core operations. And post-war, like the rest of the K-series, many were sold off and repurposed. They became logging lorries, tow rigs, and even mobile stages for fairs and events. One unique thing about the K4 is how rarely people talk about it. It wasn't built in the same numbers as the K2 or the K3, but it was every bit as reliable. It's just that most of them quietly got absorbed into civilian work, and worked until they couldn't anymore. So if you ever spot one today, rusting in a field, hiding in a shed, it's a bit of a rare find. And a reminder of just how far Austin pushed their designs during the war years. But when the fighting got more complex, Austin got even more tactical. Alright, this is where things go full military spec. The Austin K6 was a different breed altogether. Purpose-built for the war, no civilian versions, no halfway compromises, just straight up, no-nonsense battlefield utility. Launched in 1942, the K6 was a 6x4 heavy-duty chassis designed to carry specialist equipment. It wasn't just a flatbed or cargo lorry, it was a platform. You could bolt just about anything to the back. Workshops, radio units, searchlight platforms, even mobile command centers. This thing had serious off-road ability thanks to that 6x4 drivetrain. Combine that with a high ground clearance and a robust leaf spring suspension, and you've got a vehicle that could snake through mud, sand, and snow like it was nothing. The cab was classic Austin, boxy, utilitarian, and cramped, but it got the job done. And again, petrol engines were the standard, which made repairs easier across all territories where it was deployed. These lorries weren't fast, but they were ridiculously dependable. And when you're deep in field operations, that's all that really matters. The K6 ended up being used across a wide range of Allied efforts, from Europe to the Middle East. And because of its modular nature, it played more roles than any one diagram could show. One K6 might be a mobile generator station, another, a map room on wheels, total chameleon. And once the war ended, most K6s stayed with the military or were sold off to countries rebuilding their forces. Some made it into civilian use, but fewer than the other K models. If you find one now, it's usually part of a private collection, or a museum piece that still smells like WD-40 and canvas. After the war, though, Austin turned its attention back to business, civilian business. So the war ends, Britain's rebuilding, and people still need lorries, lots of them. That's where the Loadstar series comes in. The Austin K2 Loadstar was the post-war refresh of the old K2 platform. Same bones, but with a facelift. It looked cleaner, more modern. Rounded lines, curved fenders, and a slightly less military feel to the cab. Still no frills, but definitely a nod to the new era of commercial transport. Payload stayed at 2 tons, which made it perfect for urban deliveries, regional freight, and all the sort of essential work that wasn't glamorous, but paid the bills. Councils snapped these up. So did gas boards, builders, bakers, anyone who needed a reliable hauler. Mechanically, it was improved. Better gearboxes, better brakes, and a smoother ride. Not luxury, but a noticeable step forward if you'd spent the last decade bouncing around in wartime tin cans. And the Loadstar wasn't just about function, it had a certain presence on the road. The front grille had that bold, slightly Art Deco styling that felt optimistic, like a sign the country was moving forward again. You'd spot these in all sorts of configurations. Tippers, box vans, flatbeds. Some even got converted into mobile shops and wagons for fares. And because they were built tough, a lot of them survived long past their sell-by date. The K2 Loadstar wasn't just a rehash, it was Austin saying, "We've learned a lot, now let's build something better." And for thousands of businesses across Britain, it was exactly what they needed. And if the K2 Loadstar was the dependable workhorse, the K4 Loadstar was its powerhouse counterpart. This was the 5-ton variant, built on the same philosophy but scaled up to handle the heavier stuff. It had the same post-war cab styling, rounded edges, smarter details, but underneath, it was all business. You'd find K4 Loadstars doing the big jobs, council contracts, industrial freight, rural haulage, the gritty side of the recovery effort that didn't get headlines. Bricks, coal, machinery, livestock, you name it, and this lorry probably moved it at some point. And here's what set it apart. It could do the heavy work without needing the full-size multi-axle setup of a military grade hauler. That meant cheaper running costs, easier servicing, and fewer headaches for the average operator. It also rode better than the wartime K4. Not soft, but smoother, especially for drivers used to bone-shaking suspension. And that matters when you're doing 10-hour shifts with barely a lay-by in sight. The cab still wasn't luxurious, but it had better visibility, improved layout, and a more refined drive than its predecessor. Like its smaller sibling, the K4 Loadstar came in a variety of forms. Some had tipper beds, others were flat-decked for agricultural work. It was a true platform lorry, adaptable to whatever was thrown its way. And again, Austin hit that sweet spot. Simple engineering, strong build, no fuss. Just the lorry that got on with the job and made money for the bloke behind the wheel. The K4 Loadstar never really shouted for attention, but the ones that were maintained, they just kept going. Some are still kicking about today, usually on farms or tucked away in barns. Quiet survivors of a generation built to graft. But just when things were starting to feel familiar, Austin dropped something that looked and drove completely different. This is where Austin took a leap. The FG series looked like no other cab on the road when it launched in 1958. Rounded cab, narrow front, and those signature wraparound fish tank windows on the corners, you couldn't mistake it for anything else. And it wasn't just the design flex. The FG was about function, built specifically for city driving. That narrow cab made it ideal for tight streets and narrow lanes, especially in towns where clearance was tight and turns were sharper than your average A-road bend. The corner windows? Pure visibility. Drivers loved them. You could thread one of these through a crowded street like a needle. The engine was slung under the cab, forward control layout, which freed up space and improved balance. It also made maintenance easier, at least once you knew how to get the cab tilted properly. Most had 4 or 6-cylinder diesel engines, nothing groundbreaking, but dead reliable if looked after. The FG also had one of the best turning circles in the game. Drivers in urban delivery roles swore by it. Milkmen, groceries, brewery drivers, anyone who needed a lot of stops in not a lot of space. You'd see these things reversing into alleyways, pulling U-turns where other lorries would have just blocked traffic. And here's something that often gets overlooked. It was comfortable by 1960s standards. The cab was more spacious than it looked. Visibility was fantastic, and controls were laid out with a bit more thought than previous models. It wasn't plush, but it was user-friendly. By the time the FG was phased out in the late 60s, it had earned cult status. Some stayed in service for decades after, especially in public sector fleets. It was a lorry ahead of its time, built for the realities of a country that was becoming more urban, more crowded, and more delivery-focused. It marked the end of an era for Austin, but also showed they weren't afraid to rethink what a working lorry should look like. The FG wasn't just a workhorse, it was a smart one. And honestly, it still looks kind of cool. So yeah, Austin's commercial lineup from 1913 to the late 50s wasn't just about horsepower or hauling stats. These lorries carried more than weight. They carried history.